Okay.
Hello, everyone.
Hello there.
Ramadan Mubarak to anyone who's fasting today. Okay, so welcome. My name is Abdul Abdalla, and in our today's presentation, I'll be talking about the future of AI in both diagnosing and as well as a treatment plan for the Alzheimer's disease. I thought I would be the last presenter, so I prepared most of like welcome to the last presentation for the semester, but I'm gonna save that for Suyang in the next presentation. So the overview of our today's presentation, we'll quickly have a brief introduction of the Alzheimer's disease and then how AI is actually currently used. And then we'll briefly as well talk about different types of AI, especially a machine learning, an assessment tool called Consensus Network. And then we'll also move on to some of the futuristic innovations of AI when it comes to ways to fully eradicate the Alzheimer's disease. So about the Alzheimer's disease is actually the most common cause of dementia. And that is actually a group of symptoms which is associated with the decline in memory, behavior, thinking, and as well reasoning skills, causing the patients to be highly dependent on a caregiver. And so far, most of the techniques which are used, it's highly dependent on a protein that is altered, and that protein is called the tau protein. Tau is a microtubule-associated protein that stabilizes the neuronal microtubules under a normal physiological condition, right? But then what is often seen is that patients who are suffering from the Alzheimer's disease, they actually, whenever you observe their cerebrospinal fluid, that the tau protein kind of dissociates from the microtubules, and then they attach together to form the neurofibrillary tangles, and then that eventually leads to the brain of the patient being smaller, and then that is now the whole process of the Alzheimer's disease, whereby now it becomes irreversible, and once it happens, like we can't go back, and then it is also progressive, whereby it doesn't just stay, but rather it keeps the cells, the brain, the nerve cells tend on deteriorating, and at the end, it causes cell atrophy. So here is some of the statistics that I did pull from, it was the World Health Organization, and it was talking about how Alzheimer's disease actually now the 6th leading cause of death in North America, and that 1 in 10 people over the age of 65 are actually diagnosed. But then you might end up thinking, oh, that might be like, around 10%, which is not bad, as compared to other chronic illnesses such as diabetes, whereby 1/3 of the United States, for example, they are diagnosed with pre-diabetes, whereby their fasting glucose level is between 5.6 to 7 millimoles per liter. So you might be thinking, oh, this might be good, but then we have to also know that between 2017 to 2025, every state in the United States and province in Alberta, in Canada, is expected to see at least 14% rise in the prevalence of the Alzheimer's disease. And also worldwide, currently there's roughly around 50 million people with dementia. And by 2050, it is thought to exponentially rise to roughly around 130 million. So that is around 80 million increment. So there has to be something that needs to be done. We know that, yes, the population is growing, but there has to be solutions whereby we need to overcome such problem. And AI is actually could really be beneficial to make a huge impact when it comes to such instance. So with currently a lot of psychiatric disorders, they're being diagnosed using the DSM5, often called the Bible of the psychiatry. And there are often, so this manual, it groups certain psychological disorders into roughly around 22 categories. For example, the neurodevelopmental disorder, the depressive disorder, the dissociative disorder, and also we see that dementia falls along here, the neurocognitive disorder. But then there are a lot of limitations of using the DSM-5, especially when it comes to evaluating and diagnosing patients. This is because, one, the manual is very, very subjective, whereby most of the observations are based on the practitioner, what they observed from a specific patient. For example, the patient's behavior, emotions, and also some of the qualitative statements by the patients themselves. And also there was other articles which were talking about how most of the manuals, most of the data which were obtained from DSM-5 were highly based on the European Caucasian. So that leaves out other ethnicities, for example, like the African American, the Asians, and like some of the diagnoses which are put here might be skewed in a way that it might not represent the whole general population. And also another limitation is if we compare the certain biomarkers in psychiatry, like for example, we know that in the cardiac, like if you want to diagnose someone with congestive heart failure, there are certain biomarkers that you need to look for. For example, the BNP, like the brain type nitric peptides, whereby if you see, for example, if those through blood tests that it is less than 100 picograms per milliliter, then that would rule out a patient having any congestive heart failure. But when it comes to psychiatric disorder, for example, one in the Alzheimer's disease, there isn't any psychiatric biomarkers which could be evaluated or which could be followed up. So that is another limitation. And this is where even AI becomes a huge, like an innovation tool that could really help in bringing up a lot of solutions. So now we could look at also other reasons as to why AI would be helpful in the Alzheimer's disease. And that one of those includes that the health cost of the healthcare. We know that a lot of caregivers right now, the caregiver, like there's a lot of job opportunities, which is a good thing. But then what about the patients themselves? Like, for example, there's a lot of scans, the CT scans, the MRI scans, the PET scans. The patient has to do a lot of all those scans, and that costs a lot of money. Also, those scans, they might be invasive. For example, the CT scan that might be using ionizing radiation, which might not be good for the patient as well. And also I talked about the increment of patients who will be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease increasing to 130 million by 2050. That would also cause shortage of psychiatric clinicians. And as well as I mentioned previously, another reason as to why we need AI in Alzheimer's disease because there's lack of biomarkers, especially the psychological or psychiatric biomarkers. So what are the AI potentials in Alzheimer's disease? This is the main one that I will be talking about today, and that is to develop a behavior-based digital phenotype. So that basically means what are there ways we could track behavior? For example, we know that language is a form of social behavior. So are there ways we could track a patient's linguistic aspects? For example, we know that certain stuff like the poses, that the syntax, the semantics, could we track those aspects within a patient who suffers from Alzheimer's, or even could be having a mild symptoms whereby other stuff like the CT scans or the MRIs are not even still yet showing. So that is something that is actually currently being done. And we will also see an example of that. The second is another potential for AI is to know actually what the biomarker-based subtypes are. And I just mentioned about that, like if we compare to the cardiac, for example, we don't have, or even to other regions of the body, like we don't have that scalable intervention. And then also to mediate an early disease detection, a personalized treatment. So this is the precision medicine whereby we want to basically each individual to have his or her own treatment rather than just treating everything collectively. And lastly, AI could also have the potential to predict what the treatment responses are. So I will give one example of a machine learning that is currently used in the Alzheimer's disease diagnosis, and that is the consensus network. So this model, what it does is that it extracts various acoustic features. For example, the pauses, for example, the pitch, the frequency of the sound, and then it puts that into an automatic speech recognition system, which later on transcribes this obtained speech into a language generating linguistic features such as the semantic and the syntax. So why is this model very, very helpful? It is because it could be implemented daily on a linguistic analysis. You don't have to all the time, like clinicians, you don't have to go through all the like quizzes, all the attention tests and all of that. It could be done very quickly. And also it uses language expressions, which we know that your language is what dictates your thoughts. And that would eventually lead to the person or the clinicians knowing, are there any changes with the working memory, for example, with the attention, with the logical structuralization, and as well the perception. So I'll give one example, one key test which was done, and that was done on President Ronald Reagan, who was the 40th president of the United States. And he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease back in 1994. But then by using the CN model, what it could show is that actually the president could had early onsets of the Alzheimer's disease 11 years before, so around 1983. So how was it done? This is actually how it was done. So the researchers, they did extract several speech data sets. So for example, parts of speech, which are the number of pronouns, the ratio of nouns to pronouns, and what it is actually found is that patients or people who are having the Alzheimer's disease, they tend to use more pronouns than nouns. So that was first extracted, and then also the vocabulary richness were also measured, and as well the readability measures. So that is the sophistication of one's language. So I'm gonna pull this in here. So yeah, so this was the first 10 years. And then there were several speech data sets which were obtained. And then next is that a TSE was used, which is basically a stochastic number embedding system, whereby you compare the year with the number of the clusters of speech transcript. And it did show that roughly around 1983 here, there were several regions here of word frequencies which could be detected to be a little bit skewed off for the president. And then lastly, what was done was an isolation forest. And this is an algorithm which is usually generally used for anomaly detection. So this is the normal observation. So this was the control. And this is the abnormal observation. And it could have, and actually what was seen was that there were several abnormalities which could be detected from the president. And overall, what the paper here suggested was that there were reduction in the number of unique words and increase in the non-specific nouns and conversational fillers by roughly around 1983 for President Ronald Reagan. So this is actually a really good tool that really shows that if certain improvements are done in the AI, that it could really help in solving a lot of problems, especially early detections of a lot of chronic illnesses, not just the Alzheimer's disease, or even we could go for other diseases, for example, the diabetes, for example, hypertension, and many others. So now I'll shift gears and talk about what are the futuristic aspects of AI when it comes to Alzheimer's disease. So far, the CN model that I spoke of, it is just done on a computer basis. So one of the tools or one thing that could be done right now or in the future is to run, for example, the CN model unobtrusively and be integrated into the backgrounds of, for example, our smartphones. And therefore this would provide, or this would map and track signs of the Alzheimer's disease years or even months before a person gets diagnosed. As we see, like in other even areas, for example, the cardiovascular, what we see is that there are a lot of smartwatches, wristbands that could track a person's, for example, heart rate. So if we use such kind of innovation whereby now we could take that idea and then now use it into the Department of the Psychiatry, this would help a lot of patients because one, it would save time, it would be quicker, and as well, it would be very, very easy to detect any mild onsets of Alzheimer's disease. Second is we know that AI is highly used in the whole genome mapping. We're just talking about right now the 23andMe, whereby we're using a lot of these machines to tell a person's, like, for example, ethnicity or where he or she is from. But then how could we use AI in this field, for example, when dealing with the Alzheimer's disease? I briefly spoke about the tau protein. There was actually a paper that came 2 years ago, around roughly 2 to 3 years ago, around 2018, that was talking about type 1 diabetes and its association with the Alzheimer's disease, whereby we know the gene which encodes for the tau protein being MAPT, the microtubule associated protein tau, and that gene has been shown that it is also related to any alterations which occur in type 1 diabetes. In type 1 diabetes, it has been shown that the classical model suggests what causes type 1 diabetes is islet inflammation and as well the T cell mediated beta cells distraction. But then now the updated model suggests that on top of the classical model, there is beta cells degeneration, which is associated with hyperphosphorylation of the tau protein. So all this could be done using the GWAS, the genome-wide association studies, which goes along this whole genome mapping. So if we could use AI further, we could even get a lot of other associations of Alzheimer's and even several other diseases which could correlate, and then future we could even end up getting a solution to many of these chronic illnesses. And then now we could also talk about other treatment plans of using AI when it comes to the Alzheimer's disease. And this is about the whole brain emulation. We spoke, I think this was talked by and discussed about this, whereby we're talking about how in the future we could upload our, like, for example, personalities and thoughts into an artificial computational substrate, leaving behind the need for the vulnerable biological body. So we know that in the Alzheimer's, we just talked about how there is body deterioration, whereby the cells might be dying and then the brain might be shrinking and all of that. But how about if we take out the aspects that are causing or that have all the symptoms related to dementia, and we basically put it into that computer, and then the body, then that way, then the person would not need all of this caregiving and all of that. So it would be helpful, whereby we would be able to trace and know how things are going as well. And also it would be as well a form of immortality. And then lastly, AI could be used in Alzheimer's disease when it comes to a treatment plan model, which is the use of connectomes. So this is the link between the neurons and the brain. We know that the fundamental important aspect of the brain is connections, and that our brain, we really highly depend on several regions that need to be highly connected in order to have that fully functionality. So with the Alzheimer's disease, we also mentioned about part of the dementia is memory. So we know that part of the brain related to the memory will be the entorhinal cortex, and it will also be the hippocampus, for example. And then later on, what we see is that the language, like, it would kind of slow down as well. We also see that emotions, like reasoning, would also be altered, and as well the social behaviors, which all come from the cerebral cortex. So if we understand what the mapping of the brain is, what different regions are, both functionally and structurally, that would help us understand what are the specific changes that happen in the brain, especially with patients who are suffering from the Alzheimer's disease. There was also a paper that was published 2016 that mentioned about the connectomes, whereby there were 180 distinct cortical areas which were mapped, and of all that 180, 97 of them were new to the brain science, and we didn't know of. So that shows that maybe Alzheimer's could be part of those 97 regions, whereby if we fully understand through the help of AI, that this could fully help in eradicating or solving all the problems which are now ongoing when it comes to the Alzheimer's disease. So I do conclude that the advancement of technology, especially AI, is rapidly increasing, as we learned in Dr. Osmar Zayan's lectures. And what we see is that it could be a huge factor that could facilitate the eradications of many diseases, for example, the Alzheimer's disease. And I did also include about the futuristic aspects, whereby the use of, for example, the CN model into our smartphones or computers could be really helpful to trace or even observe any mild diagnosis, or even the connectomes, the genome mapping, and as well the brain emulations. Thank you.
So probably there are quite a lot of diseases that we think are without any cure, where if we knew about them early enough, there are ways to make them better. And that's quite exciting, you know, to think that there are lots of sort of risk factors that are known to increase the likelihood of Alzheimer's. But we don't really know for sure whether they would be, manipulating those could actually reverse the process. But it's possible if we knew about it early enough. Other questions, comments?
I suppose this is a really general question, but what are some barriers that you predict may, prevent the application of these technologies in the future?
So one would be, what I'm currently just thinking about is basically there is a lot of scientific knowledge, which is right now, like a lot of scientists are working on, for example, the connectomes, like knowing what are the structure and the functionality, like how do we specifically know the wiring between different neurons, and how they would eventually end up leading to, for example, this shrinkage that is observed within the nerve cells. So a limitation might be that due to misinterpretation, that is one thing that I'm not like. Right now, there's a lot of learning which is ongoing. So there might be a possibility that people might end up misinterpreting certain, for example, regions, and be like, hey, we think this might be for Alzheimer's, and then ends up being something else. So when something is new, there's always that room for error. So that is one thing that I do think might be a problem.
One of the things that, coming from the anatomical pathology point of view, it's always seemed odd to me about connectome research. So many people are using fixed brains, like formalin fixed or glutaraldehyde fixed brains, then looking at the circuits in those fixed brains. And that fixation process is a little like what happens when you put, bacon on a frying pan, right? The bacon shrinks and changes to a completely different shape. So there's no certainty that the relationships between things like cells and synapses and so on that exist in a fixed brain, in a glutaraldehyde or formalin fixed brain, is the same as it was during life, and that's what you should aim for, is that sort of pattern. And it's really hard to look at connectome in unfixed brains, like frozen brains or something like that. So this is something that people don't really talk about, in part because, I think, well, fixed is good, fixed will last forever. Why shouldn't I study connectomes in fixed brains? But nobody's ever taken a fixed brain and made it function again, right? We don't think that's possible, really.
True. So basically, what is in vivo would be different in vitro.
Yeah. I think in just in terms of basic size and shape of things, and relationship between cells and so on, that all shifts once the brain is fixed. That's not the only challenge in connectome research. The other challenge is, what if we find out that you can recreate the brain anatomically perfectly and no consciousness arises? What does that mean? So that's also a possible outcome.
I have a question based on the method you talked about, like using speech transcription to predict early signs for Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that acquiring like multi-omics data just through, for example, MRIs, like it's very invasive, or just, you get exposed to a lot of radiation. So it maybe not be feasible to get that, every single year or so. What other types of data that aren't as disruptive can be used to do this predictive analytics using AI?
Sorry, so it was the CT scan, the one that that uses the ionization rate, the ionizing radiation. Sorry, could you repeat that one more time, the question?
Yes. So what other types of data and ways to acquire that data can be used in AI for predictive analytics in Alzheimer's?
So far, what I came across was through the use of speech. And so that was the only section that I just saw, basically using different linguistic aspects. And yeah, the papers that I just came across were highly emphasizing on that. There were others that were talking about behavior, like detecting the person, like following up a person, and more of knowing like how their behavior is changing and tracking them. So I thought that would take time, and it would, and I don't think we do have actual thing, for example, like AI, that would always constantly be with the person to always observe for such a change.
So you would think that looking at like brain waves would tell you something, but I think the dynamics are all wrong. I mean, it tells you a lot about what's going on in the brain right at this moment, but it isn't able to very easily sort of aggregate these long-term changes, which is really what you're looking for. But I mean, we'll find out. Elon Musk's Neuralink, making little holes in the skull, and yeah, I mean, we'll find out pretty quickly whether there are things that you can determine that tell you about the onset of potential chronic disease, as opposed to what the person's thinking about right now. Other questions? So I want to thank you all for taking part in the course. Every term is different. So next term will be quite a bit different from this one, but I can imagine that what we talked about today and what Tiana also talked about was using AI to impact psychiatric disease. That is something we should formally add in the next term, just as we'd be adding blockchain and other things. Yeah, so I should just promote a little bit this idea of you're finding a replacement for yourself, somebody else to take the course. We're not interested in warm bodies. We're interested in people who are as good as you are, which is, that's a very high level, right? So like in the beginning of the course, we had some really poor performances, and you will notice it's pretty hard to find, like what would an example be of really poor performance this term? It'd be kind of hard, right? It's like, I don't know. And that's really cool, and it's not just superstars. Like we had the Peter Lougheed Leadership Program. People from that program would come in, and one of their characteristics was there was such a steep, trajectory of personal improvement that like a year after they take the course, they want the video taken down because they're doing such higher level stuff now, but anyway, but I also wasn't satisfied having just a lot of these very, very high performing students. I like sort of a mix, or people who are actually doing really well in this course, but ordinarily get B's. They always get B's, they just always get B's, but they got really turned on here and they put in a really good performance. So the reason that I would like you to find people to take the course is that will give us higher quality people for the course and sort of keep this culture going of also diversity, of like all sorts of different people from different walks of life, and people who know a lot about medicine, including medical students, and people who know virtually nothing about medicine. I think it's good to have a mix. And then knowledge of, philosophy is also important. So yeah, anyway, and everything in between. So as I said, this is kind of the last session of this term, but there may be one extra session, but that would be voluntary on your part. You would not be forced to take part. But anyway, thank you for taking the course. Thank you for sticking it out almost to 4 o'clock on April 15th. So you're like the survivors, So yeah. And yeah, and if you want to do other things related to the course, that is certainly possible. I've been thinking that we need 4 TAs. Right now we have 2, but if you pick really high performing people who are strongly motivated doing their own thing, you probably need more than 2 TAs. So if any of you are keen to be a TA in the future, we'd be happy to have you. Want to take part in the future and all that jazz. We need more student involvement in the next year because we're producing an actual album, you know, and musical and poetry album in June 2022. And we want a lot of young people input and diverse young people input from all sorts of, you know, not only contributing directly, but also advising us what would be the kind of product you would like to see emerging in June 2022. So, yeah. Okay, thank you all very much, and stay in touch to the extent that you wish to. Yeah. All right. Thank you for saying that. Yeah. All right. So,
Hey, Dr. Solis.
yeah.
I have a really good person to replace me for next semester.
Excellent.
Yeah, we have a very I guess similar approach and energy to just this discussion of, you know, the future of technology and medicine.
Yeah.
How do I get him like acquainted, or do I just get him to email you?
Yeah, he can email me directly. Yeah, that's the usual way. Sure, that would be fine.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it's always nice to have a nidus of good people, you know, in the spring. I know that the course doesn't start again until the fall, but I hate to go into the fall having very few numbers and feeling desperate, you know. It's sort of nice
Mhm.
to have a lot of people lined up early on, and also to encourage them if they wish to you know, take part in the other things that we are doing. Yeah, there's also my birthday party on June 20th, which will be quite a lot of fun. This will be 4 separate sort of parties within that day with different themes. You know, you can think the different themes in the course. So,
Wow.
and that could, you know, include people from all over the world. There'd be a 7:30 a.m. session. Could include people from Nepal and Europe, and you know, other things like that. So it should be a really fun day. It's also Father's Day, and it's the summer equinox, all on the same day, June 20th, 2021. So you may also want to take part in that on that Sunday. Yeah, and that's open to anybody who's interested. So, okay, well, my goodness, it's 4 o'clock. So thank you all, and look forward to staying in touch with you. Okay, bye bye now.